Hi, everybody. This is Jenny.
And this is Alexa.
And you're listening to Checked Out, the Lexington Public Library podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a book called The Return by Hisham Martar. And I'm probably butchering his name, and our special guest will fix it for me. Before we get started talking about the book, I just want to do a couple housekeeping things real fast. If you like the podcast, if you listen to the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes and go online and give us a rating. And that will help other people find us in iTunes and give us an idea of who's listening. Also, if you like the podcast, the library has a huge selection of e-audiobooks that you can download to your smartphone or to a media player and listen to in your car or on a walk or at the gym or wherever you're listening to this podcast. You could be listening to an audiobook. I know I love them. They make my commutes much better and make me less stabby in traffic. The traffic's really awful, so I'm a big fan. Well, today we have a very special guest with us. Mariam, a librarian from the Central Library, is joining us to talk about The Return by Hisham Martar. Is that right?
Yes, his name is Hisham Martar.
See, it sounds so much better when Mariam says it.
It's much more elegant.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. So we'll just give you a little bit of background about the book. As we always say, this is a spoiler-free podcast. So if you haven't read the book yet and you want to be surprised by the ending, stop listening now and go put a hold on it and check it out. But it's also a book that doesn't really have a definitive kind of... it's a beautiful book to read, even if you know what's coming.
Exactly, yeah. And I think a lot of memoirs and nonfiction can kind of be described as that. Because, I mean, it happened. It's
Absolutely.
real. So, I mean, there's not really spoilers to real life, I don't think.
It's somebody's truth, so.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's beautifully, beautifully written.
It is.
It's one of the most beautifully written books I think I've ever read. The language is just wonderful. The Return is nonfiction. It is the story, it is Hisham's story of his father, who, say his name for me, Mariam.
Jaballa Matar.
See, so much better. He was a revolutionary against the Gaddafi regime in Libya. His father actually worked for King Idris. Is that am I saying that right?
King Idris, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
He was worked for his government, the UN, correct?
He did, I think. He was a special envoy for the United Nations, I believe, yeah.
And then in 1969, Gaddafi led a small band of military men in a coup and overthrows the king. So Hisham's family returns briefly, I believe, to Libya, and then they fled to Egypt.
Correct. I believe right after the coup of 69, Jaballa Matar returned. He was in London at the time on work, and he returned to Libya and subsequently imprisoned, I believe, for about 4 months, which happened to a lot of the top military guys in Libya at the time. Muammar Gaddafi wanted to kind of test the waters with them. He wasn't sure, if they would be supportive of him, and so he kind of basically arrested all of them and threw them in prison.
See how that goes over.
Yeah. But I think it was his way of asserting his role in the country and make sure that, hey, I'm the boss and this is how things are from here on out. Jaballa Matar, I think, was released after a few months. And he mentions this in his book, Hisham does, where... that a lot of the top military officers, even the ones that helped him with the coup, were sent abroad to kind of get them out of the way so that he can, change whatever policies and whatever institutions he wanted to, and while they weren't watching.
He made them ambassadors. A lot
of time, envoys, special envoys overseas. So whatever, just to get them out of the country.
Right.
Sent them out on business. He sent them to study abroad. A lot of them, finished PhDs or. And the whole point was to get them out of the country. Mm-hmm. But, it's hard to keep what's going on in the country, even if you're abroad, when you talk to family, even back then. So, but yeah, that was a tactic that he used very early on in his regime.
Mm-hmm. And so Hisham's family ends up fleeing to Egypt, where his father continues working from afar to oppose Gaddafi's regime. and then in 1990 is captured by the Egyptian secret police and sent to Libya and imprisoned in Abu Salim, which is a notorious prison in Libya for, I guess, for people who were in opposition to Gaddafi. Is that correct?
Essentially that's where a lot of the political prisoners were sent. The majority, if not all, were all political prisoners over there at one time or another. And it was notorious for their torture. Family weren't allowed to visit. So it was basically the dark hole where a lot of the political prisoners went to. Jaballah, along with Azzat Lemgarieff, who was also part of the opposition movement, were kidnapped by the Egyptian police, and subsequently we would find out later that they were taken to Abu Salim, to Tripoli, and disappeared for years. Nobody really knew where they were.
Yeah, Hisham was very young when he was in college. He was in college when this happened, correct?
Yeah. 19, I think.
I think he says he was 19.
And soon, the book is the story of his family's return in 2012 to go back to Libya. It's the first time he returns since he was a child, and it's the story of the family going back, and also of him trying to kind of find out what happened to his dad. They start to ask a lot of questions about what happened to his father, ultimately. There was a large massacre in 1996 at the prison. I think the estimate from the UN that I saw was 1,270 prisoners,
correct,
I think, were killed at the time. And so he's basically trying to figure out if his father was killed then, was he killed before, was he killed after, is he still alive somewhere? So that's sort of ostensibly what the book is about. But it's also really a love letter to his father, to his father's fight, and to sort of figuring out your place in the world when you don't really have... You don't have that centered home, kind of.
Yeah. If you're coming to this book because you want to know about the politics of Libya, this is not the book for you. This was more about the relationship that he had with his father, or, his mother describes his father, the absent present, and the relationship with that absence. And it was so beautifully done, I think, in such a lyrical way. He writes so beautifully. But yeah, it's more about that relationship and trying to find answers, what happened to his father, and he wanted to know the truth, and the hope that he hung on to, that maybe he would find his father alive. And that was something that he grappled with for, his entire adult life. I really, if you've read Hisham Martar's previous fiction novels, he has two other books. The first one is called In the Country of Men, and the second one is In the Anatomy of a Disappearance. It was kind of hard reading the book and not thinking that it was either, Suleiman of In the Country of Men or Nouri of, Anatomy of a Disappearance, especially when he talks about his childhood. So it was, when you read them, you kind of like, you read it and you think that it reads kind of almost fiction. I mean, right. The intrigue of, especially with his brother, the attempted kidnap of his brother and all that. But then you come to a stop, and it's like in your gut clenches, and you're like, wait a minute, this is truth. This is his truth.
There were several times when I had to remind myself this was not a work of fiction I was reading, that this was real life.
So so I found it interesting that his mother asks him in the beginning, who's returning to Libya? Is it Suleiman or Nouri? And I thought it was, just reading the book, it was sometimes I got thrown into one of his other books that as if it was fiction, but this is an actual memoir. And it's heartbreaking at times, but at times there is that glimpse of hope, and that glimpse of optimism, which is kind of hard to maintain in living that kind of life with a disappeared father and not knowing the answers to how and what happened to him.
The amount of optimism in a book of this, it is a dark read. It is depressing, but it's so beautiful. It's beautiful. It's lyrical, like you said. And, I mean, the ability that he has to maintain that optimism and that hope is just incredible.
Yeah.
And his whole family, because it's not just his father who's imprisoned. He has many uncles and cousins who end up in prison as well. And a generational thing, because his father, his father's that age group go and get imprisoned in the 80s and 90s, and then we find out later on his cousin and brother take up the fight in 2011 and 2012.
The revolution that broke out February 17th,
and they take up that as well and are affected by it. So it's a generational thing for this family. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, Libya is a young country. I mean, they achieved statehood in 1951, so there has been turmoil from one generation to the other. So I mean, all the generations have known some sort of turmoil, whether it's the Italian colonization, the discovery of oil, and then the subsequent coup that Gaddafi did for 42 years, and then the revolution that brought so much hope. And in that window of, when Hisham goes back to Libya in March, and that whole summer of 2012, there was that window of hope that justice is going to prevail, and that, that there's hope for this country to kind of move forward. And then, but then there's the civil war breaks out, and everything is kind of crushed, basically.
Right.
So that, it's the whole story of the struggle is endless, basically, for Libyans. And it's the story of so many Libyans, unfortunately. With his uncles being in prison, that's a tactic that the regime used to sort of pressure people into silence. So a lot of the opposition movement, men and women, whoever left and was exiled, their families were the brunt of the rage of the regime. Houses were torn down. Men were imprisoned. The regime threatened the locals and the neighbors to not help families of those affected, or else. That was the fear tactics that the regime used. Which made towards the end of the book, when Saif al-Islam tries to sort of, bring him back in as if, everything is going to be reconciled and there's reform. And
that we should mention, for those who don't know, that is Gaddafi's son.
Yes.
Muammar's son, Hisham and his brother put in contact with, actually, as they start to put more pressure on the British government through their work with the Libyan government to figure out what happened to his father. And so he gets put in contact with Gaddafi's son, and the son tries to convince him that it's sort of a weird time in history, reading the book, and Alexa and I talked about this, how strange it was for us. Neither of us were aware of I guess, the attempts to legitimize the Gaddafi regime,
right?
And Tony Blair, making the visit. And
I went into this book with very little working knowledge of Libya.
Exactly,
which is I think most readers
part of the course.
I knew Gaddafi was not a good guy.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all I knew.
I knew Gaddafi. I knew Tripoli. I knew Benghazi. I knew keywords.
Yeah.
I was I know that, and that's about all I had going into it.
But this attempt in the late. Probably, I guess, to 2010 or so, them trying to, right before the revolution, of trying to legitimize the regime and no, everything's cool now, you guys. We're letting political prisoners go. Look at us. And
we've joined the 21st century.
Yeah, exactly.
Come on.
Great.
Yeah, jump on this boat.
Right? We've decided to stop all the human rights abuses.
Yeah.
And
we promise we won't do that anymore.
Right?
Yeah. And here's some money to shut you up.
Exactly. And they start doing that to Hisham and his brother, and come back and live, and why don't you come back? We want to give you money. We want to give you awards for your writing. You're such a well-known Libyan now.
Oh, that I read that. I was laughing so hard because Hisham's writing is beautiful. It's great, and he was winning all these awards and
shortlisted for the
and
Booker.
then Libyans all of a sudden decided that they wanted a piece of that. It's
hey, books had been banned, I think, in Libya for a long time.
That's what was funny. Is nobody was allowed to read his books in Libya, and yet they wanted to give him awards for it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's just a really kind of fascinating piece of recent history that I really knew nothing about.
Absolutely.
It was fascinating to read.
It was during the time that was around the time, I think, when Muammar Gaddafi decided to come and show up at the UN General Assembly. I think a lot of Libyans here in America went and protested in New York when he decided to show up and pitch his tent, I guess, in whatever in New York. But it was a blow. It was a blow to the opposition that was already fragmented and already, trying to pick up the pieces. And it was disheartening, I think. And that was what made 2011, in February 2011, the revolution when it broke out. That's what it kind of blew life into the Libyan people again, which unfortunately didn't last very long. But yeah, that was disheartening. And reading that, and just the manipulative nature of Saif and the way he talked to Hisham.
He sets out all these things that he has to do before he will give him information, and he knows.
And he was dragging it,
and he knows what happened.
Right. And that's the I'm not sure he knew. To be honest, it was him. Like, I think he wanted to find answers for him, but he didn't want to do it he didn't want to risk his position as the future heir apparent and ask the right people the wrong questions. He wanted it to come from him, from he wanted him to print something in the Egyptian newspaper as if
he wanted them to give an interview to this journalist that was kind of shady and sympathetic to the Gaddafi.
It was so bizarre. But that was how they operated, again, to legitimize a regime that didn't deserve legitimization because of what they did, and their history and their human rights abuses. So, but yeah, reading that, it was just like, oh my God.
When they talk
how
about,
far does the manipulation go?
Right.
Exactly. And when they talk about, in, I guess, 2011, they liberated the prison. Abu Salim was liberated.
Yes, in August of 2011.
Yes.
I guess what people kind of labeled it as the end of the revolution, which doesn't really happen. But yeah, Abu Salim was liberated, and He says in the book that he doesn't go back to visit the prison. It's empty now. There's nothing there. It's completely abandoned. And I'm kind of happy he didn't go. When we went in the summer with my family, my children and I, again, my husband's uncle was also a disappeared opposition member, and he was there. So my husband felt like the need to go, and so I went with him. It was a very eerie place, and I wish I didn't go. Because you see the despair there, even though it is abandoned. But the writings on the prison walls, the cells, and it was decrepit place, and I can't imagine how people spent decades there. There's people there that were like imprisoned for 30 years. It was depressing.
And they said there were like secret cells as well. They found a blind guy hiding down in the basement, basically.
I'm not sure who that prisoner was, to be honest. I've never found out what the name of that person was, but it was very difficult to walk through that prison. Because, a lot of people went back there to find answers, and not very many people found the answers, with the exception of Mansour Kikhia, who was also a prominent opposition member. He was actually Libya's UN envoy as well, that opposed Muammar Gaddafi, and he was kidnapped from Egypt in 1993. Subsequently, his body was found in 2012 after Abdullah Sunusi, which Hisham mentions in his book as well. He's the head of the Secret Service, and also the mastermind behind the downing of a French ET liner in the late 80s, I think. But anyways, during his interrogation, he revealed where Mansour Kikhia was buried. And when his body was found, I think there was some hope that maybe they would find Izzat Lemgeriev and Jabal Matar as well. But that didn't happen. During the interrogation, he said that he doesn't know any information about that. But, a lot of people wanted answers, and they didn't get any because nobody was forthcoming with it. And they kind of just passed the buck to the next, whoever authority figure was responsible. at the time. A lot of the regime members escaped and now are living underground, whether it's in Tunisia or
Gaddafi's son is still alive, correct?
Oh, yes. Yeah. He's, there's rumors always going. He's in prison in the western side of Libya, in a city called Zintan. There's a militia there that's holding him. I'm not sure, what they plan to do with him right now, but I know the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has a case against him and against Abdullah Senussi. Abdullah Senussi is being held in a Tripoli prison currently. The Libyans don't want to hand them over. They believe that they have sovereignty, and they want to try them in Libya. There's not really a judiciary that can handle that kind of, I think, in Libya right now, especially the climate, the current political climate. It doesn't lend itself to a fair trial, you can say. Right. People are barely managing to survive day to day over there right now. So, but yeah, currently there is an ICC case against him, and they want him handed over. I'm not sure what the status is of that situation is, but yeah, reading that in the book, it brought me back to the days of pre-revolution, 2011, and during the revolution, and a lot of it was painful, given the current climate and how just hopeless the situation seems right now. Going back to those days, it's like, oh yeah, I remember.
He talks a lot in the book about that window of hope and how unless it was teetering on the brink, it could have gone one of two ways.
Yeah. The time that he went back, the return, his return, everything was going against Libya at the time. I mean, there was nothing to be able to build a nation on. There was no institutions. There was, again, no judiciary. There was nobody. Gaddafi was it. He was the one in charge. So when he left, there was nobody in charge. So there was a huge vacuum, and whatever, organization or whatever governing body came through, whether it's the transitional council or the newly elected parliament, which was elected, I think, in July of 2012 at the time. When you don't have institutions to build on, it's very difficult to build a nation on
You're building
nothing.
From scratch,
Essentially. And, add into the mix the different militias that are rivaling for power, the tribal situations. That was something that Gaddafi actually built on. He really fed into the festering tribal, what do you call it? Like the tribal factions, the different, I guess you can say, disagreements or whatever. He really fed into that, and that kind of exploded after the revolution. There was no accountability. There was no sense of security forces that would enforce the rule of law. So a lot of people took the law into their own hands, and currently they're grappling with that until now, with the rival militias and the kidnappings, and then add ISIS to the mix, and that can and the different international factions that want to serve their own interests. So that's a lot to grapple with, and unfortunately it mixed all together and gave us the current situation. Going back to what Alexis earlier said about not knowing anything about Libya, and just she knew Tripoli and she knew Benghazi, and unfortunately Benghazi, the city where my husband is from, that's where we went to visit in 2012, and it was such a beautiful city. The people there are so gracious, and the hospitality, the beauty of the city, the mix of the historical aspect of Benghazi, the Italian structures, and the deep tradition there, and the beautiful coastline, and that was the Benghazi I knew, and the Benghazi that the people of Benghazi knew. So when the whole situation with the U.S. ambassador Chris Stevens, when he was killed in that the embassy raid, that was what the rest of the world knew. That was the Benghazi, and it was heartbreaking, because that situation does not define the city. And Hisham in this book describes Benghazi in such a beautiful
way.
And I was like, yes, this is the Benghazi I know. Yeah. This is what the Benghazi that my children knew and what they have in their mind.
And he talks about the blend of cultures.
Yes.
And the influence from, the Ottomans and then the Italians.
Yeah. And there's the Greek, and the eastern side of the Roman structures. And it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. So that to me, when I read that, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. And he talks about the coast and the beaches and the water.
Before Benghazi was just a political buzzword.
Exactly.
It's an actual place.
Yes, and there's real people there that are, that are struggling.
Yeah.
So the way he talks about it was so beautiful, and I'm glad he did that. And introduced people and his readers to that.
He's great at putting you in that place, and I think that. I know I'm really bad about when I picture the world, looking at it, through my kind of worldview, my lens as an American, but he pulls you out and puts you in a different part of the world and seeing a place like Benghazi and this beautiful, wonderful city and how fast.
And the rich, literary scene in Benghazi. Right. I mean, even when my dad talks about Benghazi, that's, people, that was their life. They gathered and they talked about literature and poetry, and some of the best poets are from the eastern side of the country in Libya, and so it was really nice reading that, and how he described it is really beautiful. And that's something that he does a lot throughout the book, is he has a lot of literary references in this book.
Yeah, he finds out his dad was quite the writer.
Yeah,
yes, I loved that. Oh my gosh, beautiful.
When he discovered his father's writing was so amazing. Especially after he got the award for his first book, and just finding out, reading his father's writing.
I loved reading the little snippets from the short stories.
Yeah.
We should tell people who haven't read, there's a scene in the book where they're back in Libya, and he's giving a reading, Hisham's giving a reading, and talking about his book. And he makes eye contact with an old man in the front row who's sitting there holding a leather-bound book, kind of shaking. And he comes up to him at intermission and hands him. And his father in college was part of the college literary society, one of the founding members, I think.
Yeah, in Tripoli.
And he had all of it bound into one volume for him, and he gives it to him. And he knew his father wrote poetry, he knew his father loved poetry, but he didn't know he had written fiction. And so he gets to read these short stories of his father's, and it's just such a beautiful moment where he gets to discover his father as a young man.
Yeah, and no, because when he was younger, he always, his father was a military man. He, was this prominent businessman and this prominent opposition member, and he was this really, tough go-getter, but for him to discover that he had this connection with his father, the literary aspect of it was such, I'm glad that he got that. And in that same meeting, there was the same gentleman, he got up and spoke about Hisham's mother.
Yes.
Right.
So beautifully. And he talked about how his mother, opened her home in Tripoli for the prisoners that were, leaving Gaddafi's prisons when they were released right after the coup. She opened up their homes to their families when they came to visit their male relatives in prison, and she, she was such a gracious host to them, and the women of the opposition movement are some of the most unsung heroes. So I'm going to get emotional. I remember my mother, my father traveled a lot for the opposition movement. She was such a strong figure in our family. Without her, I think my father couldn't have done what he did, and I think a lot of the opposition men in the movement wouldn't have survived without them.
There's the beautiful scene where they talk about their mother making meals for the men and care packages and taking them stationary, and it's that morale boost that is just like you said, they wouldn't have been able to carry on without that.
And she's so just humble and self-effaced. I didn't even do that.
Yeah, she was like, I don't even remember it, because they did it out of love and out of. It wasn't. She's the good wife, she has to stand by her man. It wasn't like that. It was, yes, it was part of that, but it was true love of people. Not just your husband, but also for what he stood for. He was a man of honor. He was a man of, he knew what he knew what his country was capable of, and he fought for it. And she stood next to him, not behind him. And for her to put up with a disappeared husband all these years and raise 2 sons, and she did it in such a silent manner, I think was such a good tribute of the gentleman to go and speak about his mother. And that was the story of a lot of women of the opposition and the exiled, because a lot of them were exiled not by choice. They just followed their husband, thinking that it was just going to be 2 years, maybe 3 years. I tell the story of my mother always having a storage room, saving up for when she went back home, when my father first started with the opposition movement in the early 80s. And I remember we were in Morocco and Sudan and Egypt, and she was saving, all these trinkets and things that she was going to take back home with her to Libya to decorate her house. But it never came to fruition, unfortunately. And it wasn't until we moved here to the U.S. in 1986 that we finally felt like, okay, we need to put roots here. And she, I think, realized that too, and kind of, she was our strength in the present, like Hisham said about his mother. His father held on to the rich history of his country and kind of fought for the future of his country, but the women anchored the present because, there's children that need to be taken care of. There's a life to live. There's a home to be made. And they did that with such grace and strength, and they don't get thanked enough for it.
It's really the story of women throughout history, the ones who hold down the home front and make sure that life can continue and things can go on, and whose struggles and whose roles in revolutions are often overlooked and not talked about.
Exactly.
And like you said, I was so glad that that moment is included in the book to give his mom her due.
Right.
Yeah.
And talk about the importance of her role. I love the family, the way he describes his family. There's the way they talk about when they're together. Just seems so much warmth from all of them, and I love that. One of the things that just stuck with me is that they'd all sleep or hang out in the same bed. These tiny little twin beds. He and his brother were living together, and his dad would come visit, and they would sleep, or they would lay together like head to foot, so they were facing each other, and just get real cozy and have these long talks. And I thought that was just such a sweet moment, and it spoke to just how close they were, really.
Yeah, and I think also because of Hisham's family, I believe, is from Jdabia, which is a Bedouin. Kind of the eastern, the families there are very still live. The houses are kind of small, and that was how the families lived, especially in the in the hot summer months where they would all live in one room for the air conditioning, or that was just the way that and it did foster this really tight knit family unit and families over there. But the scenes with his family always centered around food. That's how it is, and it's like meals were an event. But the way he described his relationship with his family, because that's, I think for me, going back, that's what really tied me to Libya. Growing up, hearing my family, my parents talking about Libya like this, it's some sort of heaven on earth, and you go back and it's kind of, there's a little bit of a disappointment. When I landed there in my plane, on the plane, I expected there to be sort of connection. There wasn't. It wasn't until I got to my aunt's house, and started talking, and that's when you start making the connection, and that's when. So it's not the actual physical place, but it's the connection that you have with your family, with the interactions you have with people on the street. Even when I'm here in the U.S., when I'm cooking traditional food for my kids, I think to myself, my grandmother made these same dishes for her family, and those are the connections that matter, and that's what makes me feel Libyan, not necessarily being there, not physically. So. Those scenes are some of the most beautiful, I think, that he describes, and the most comforting, I think, after experiencing such horror from the regime. But it's those connections that kind of, humanize this horrible situation.
We were talking a little bit before we started recording about how he can take these just horrifying images and he can just do a pivot so quickly and bring levity to it. And there's a scene in the book where his aunts, I believe, are making you call it sugar wax?
Yeah.
And they really liked it when they were kids because it's like syrup.
It tastes good.
It's just sugar, and they would use it to wax their arms and their legs and stuff. And it's just such an interesting scene. I mean, and it's really one of those scenes that Jane was talking about where it's like this big family gathering and all of the cousins are running around, and they would tell one of his girl cousins, well, you'll have to do this eventually one day. And she's just like, no. Why would I ever do that? And it's just, and for all of the darkness and kind of just the tragedy of this book.
He does it so beautifully, though, in the book. Like, he could describe this horrible, like, scene where his father's picking up body parts from the street, or or the scenes where he's describing what happened in Abu Salim, but he pivots so gracefully, though. He does it in a very seamless way.
He's got just such a mastery of the language in this book. It's insane.
Yeah, I mean, all of his like references to the story of Odysseus and his
Telemachus.
son Telemachus.
Yeah, there's a strong current here to the Odyssey.
Strong current to the Odyssey. Yeah.
I loved.
Yeah.
I did too. I had to pull out my copy a few times when I was reading this. I was just like, what did Telemachus do? Let me go back and review this.
Yeah. His father is, and you realize it has to be very close. I guess Telemachus was probably very young when Odysseus left, and never really knew his father till adulthood. And that's sort of Hisham. His father's a lot like a ghost. He kind of flits in and out of the story. Yeah. He's never fully formed all the way, although you get some clear pictures of him, some pictures clearer than others, and that's got to be what he is. For Hisham, he's not, because he doesn't know him as an adult, he's never fully formed in his eyes. He knows him as a child and a father, but not as a man. And I think that part of going back to Libya for him was hoping to discover his father, the man. Yeah,
and that was essential to him. I think even when he was, with the conversations he had with his aunts and his uncles and his brother-in-law and his father's brother-in-law, and I think he got that. He was able to get that, especially through his father's writing and experiencing the family home and all that. I'm glad he returned. In the beginning of the book, he actually struggles. He, in the airport scene, the opening scene, he's like, "Do I want to go? Do I
really want to do this?
Yeah.
Do I want to open this
and
wound?"
he actually makes references to other literary figures like Conrad and Nabokov, and they never returned from exile. And he says, like, return and you will face the absence of or defacement of what you treasured, because you have this memory of this country that you kind of mystified, and but you're scared to go back and see something that you don't want to see.
And never meet your heroes.
Yeah, exactly. And that was a little bit true for me as well when I went back. You hear about Libya and all the graceness of it and the people and and I didn't find it in a lot of the places. So I found it with my family. I mean, it's completely different when you're with your family. When you are in other gatherings, like, with social gatherings, and people question your Libyan-ness, or they question your motives for coming back. Oh, you're coming back because, you think you can help build this country and we can't, or they make you feel guilty that you lived in exile in America and they had to struggle under a repressive regime, and he actually mentions that also. He says, guilt is the exile's eternal companion. It stains every departure. And that was another level of animosity between Libyans, is, the people that are that were living in exile, or the diaspora that were coming back to Libya just to visit, or whether it's just to visit or actually work there. There was a level of animosity between the two. And a lot of the diaspora that were going back were looking down on the Libyans that were there, as if they were some sort of people from, backward society, or, no, you should live your life this way. And that fed into it as well. A lot of the people that were living in exile went back thinking that they were going to, be the saviors of this country. And that wasn't true because they were gone. They don't know the mechanics of the country. They don't know the mechanics of the people there and how things work. And they didn't take the time to listen. So that was another level of animosity and things that were going against the country right after the revolution. But yeah, he writes so beautifully and makes a lot of literary references that I think are relevant and just right. But yeah, and to that, there's a quote, one of my favorite quotes from Mariam Adenish. She says, "You will never be completely at home again because part of your heart will always be elsewhere. That is the price you pay for the richness of loving and knowing people in more than one place." And we discussed this earlier about, you're never Libyan enough and you're never American enough. But that's the life that you have to live. You kind of have to accept both worlds. And that's because each world is a part of you. And for me, I don't define myself as just American or just Libyan because there's so many aspects of me that include both, and I'm both. And Hisham does that beautifully as well in his book. He struggles, with the love of Libya and but at the same time being forced to make home in London or in America or, and he's both, and he does it. He shows that in his book. So
one of my coworkers grew up in Cuba and was a political prisoner and fled and has lived in America for over 20 years. And now as sort of relations are thawing, he's talking about going back and taking his husband with him. And he made a comment to me the other day that something about how his husband could never truly understand him and understand Cuba until he went. Until he went to where he had grown up, and he had seen where he grew up, and he saw his family, and he had been to where his husband grew up in Alabama and knew his family, but to take him there, to take him to Cuba and show him was going to be such a vital part of their marriage. And I just thought that was just so beautiful, the way he described it.
Yeah. You can't really know until you experience it. So
right.
But yeah. So
it's a beautiful, beautiful book. I can't say enough about it.
It is, yeah.
If you just want to read a great memoir, this is the book for you. If you have any interest in learning more about Libya, this is a great book. Like Mariam said, he doesn't get a lot into the politics of it, so
it's a good starting place.
It's a good starting point, exactly. It's a good entry-level book on Libyan history and politics, but it's also, above all, it's just a beautifully written book. And a beautifully written story of a father and a son and trying to figure out what happens. It's not... I started it thinking it was going to be kind of a mystery and we would find out what happens to his father. We never do. He doesn't know to this day, for sure. Probably never will. And sort of part of the story is coming to terms with that as well.
Yeah, and throughout the book he says he's always been a prisoner of hope, and hope finding his father, whether he's alive or answers, or he wants a body to bury. That he wanted that, the finality of a funeral, but he comes to terms with just not knowing, and that's the case for a lot of Libyan families, unfortunately. So.
There's even a point, I think, where one person says they saw him in the courtyard the day of the execution, the mass execution in 96, and it turns out later the person kind of recants the story a little bit and says, oh, no, I didn't actually see him. Someone pointed him out to me.
And said that's Jabal Matar. Yeah, that's... that happened a lot, actually, with not just Jabal, with also with Izzat al-Mgariyef. People were so eager to help and find, and so a lot of the prisoners that survived the massacre in Abu Sadim came and they contacted the families. I saw Jabal, I saw Izzat, and they didn't really. Nobody really knows. This book kind of comes to terms with that. And Hisham, I think at the end, it's kind of like, okay, this is where it is. And that's okay.
Yeah. It might not be the story that anybody wanted, but that's the story that
it is.
It is, exactly.
Well, I can't recommend it enough. I think it was beautiful.
It was really wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Mariam.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.